Good morning, this is your Kelso Report for Wednesday, October 31st, and I'm your host, Clark Kelso. Well, this week the United States Supreme Court granted cert in 3 cases. The first involves the doctrine of equitable tolling of limitations periods in a habeas context. The second involves an exception to the discharge of certain debts in bankruptcy, and the third involves foreign tax credits. The Supreme Court of California also issued an important opinion re-emphasizing the rule that courts should generally defer to agency interpretations of their own regulations. Well, first let's look at this U.S. Supreme Court. As you know, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act has a relatively short limitation period for inmates to file their federal habeas claims in federal court, a 1-year period generally. One of the unresolved questions is the extent to which that limitation period is subject to the doctrine of equitable tolling. In McQuiggan v. Perkins, the Sixth Circuit held that when a petitioner was seeking equitable tolling of the limitation period pursuant to a claim of actual innocence, the petitioner did not need to make a showing of reasonable diligence in pursuing his claim. The Supreme Court has granted review in McQuiggan, so we will hopefully learn whether or not there is a reasonable diligence requirement for securing equitable tolling of EDPA's statute of limitation due to actual innocence. My guess is the court will say you have to have reasonable diligence. You can't simply sit back and wait. But we'll see what they do. After all, claims of actual innocence are pretty important on the merits. Next, the court has granted review in Bullock v. Bank Champagne to consider whether a particular type of judgment debt is exempt from being discharged in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy proceeding. The judgment debt arose out of the lawsuit where it was determined that the Chapter 7 debtor had breached his fiduciary duty by self-dealing while serving as a trustee of his father's trust. The applicable bankruptcy statute creates an exception to discharge for cases involving fiduciary fraud or defalcation. And the Court of Appeal held that defalcation requires a showing of recklessness by the fiduciary, a standard the court held had been met on the facts. We'll see in this case how the Supreme Court interprets the fiduciary fraud or defalcation discharge exception. And third, we have a tax case where the court has granted review. The case is PPL Corporation v. Commissioner of Internal Revenue, and the court granted review to resolve an important corporate tax question involving creditable foreign taxes. The corporate taxpayer here argued that it was entitled to a foreign tax credit for its share of a windfall tax which was paid by a United Kingdom utility in which the taxpayer held a 25% interest. The United States Tax Court agreed with the taxpayer, but the Third Circuit reversed, concluding that the United Kingdom windfall tax failed to satisfy the gross receipts requirement for recognizing and crediting a foreign tax. The Supreme Court has taken the case to give us the proper interpretation of the gross receipts requirement in the context of the United Kingdom's windfall tax. And finally, an administrative law decision from the California Supreme Court. As you know, one of the fundamental principles of administrative law is that courts will generally defer to an agency's interpretation of its authorizing statutes and its own regulations. This principle is supported by basic separation of powers principles, in light of the fact that Congress or a state legislature has expressly authorized the agency to use its own expertise and discretion in implementing a statute, and has usually also been authorized to promulgate and implement its own regulations. Federal cases refer to this principle as Chevron deference, which refers, of course, to the Supreme Court's leading decision in Chevron v. Natural Resources Defense Council from 1984. Well, a similar principle applies under state administrative law, as the California Supreme Court has reminded us with its decision this week in re Cabrera, which involved the proper interpretation of regulations promulgated by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation that set forth the procedures and substantive requirements for validating an inmate as a member of a prison gang. Now, being validated as a gang member can have serious consequences in prison, such as having the inmate placed in a security housing unit, which is essentially a form of solitary confinement. According to the relevant regulations, one of the requirements for being validated is that there must be some documented item that has a, quote, direct link, close quote, to a current or former gang member or associate. The Court of Appeal interpreted the direct link language as requiring some type of reciprocal communication between the inmate and the gang member. Well, that was contrary to CDCR's interpretation that a direct link could be a unilateral connection. The California Supreme Court held that the Court of Appeal had failed to accord due deference to the CDCR's interpretation of its own regulations, and it reversed the judgment of the appellate court. And that's it for today's Kelso Report. Have a great day in the law.